Good morning, everyone. It is 9:30, so let's get started. Today we're talking about asphalt remediation projects. My name is Melissa Wrubel. I'm an engineer with Kipcon. I've been with Kipcon for about 15 years now, and I deal with mostly site work projects. So that's, I guess in layman's terms, everything but the building. So asphalt projects fall within my realm of expertise at Kipcon, and that's what I'll be talking about today. So thank you for joining. So let's talk about different types of pavement first. So today we're going to be talking specifically about asphalt. There are other types of pavement that you may have in your community, even in your roadway. People usually associate asphalt with roadway pavement, but oftentimes there can be areas of pavement or even throughout having a concrete pavement. So that's a rigid type of pavement. Today we're going to be talking specifically about bituminous asphalt pavement. And that can be in your roadways, in your parking areas. That type of pavement, asphalt pavement, can be in your walking paths. So that's just some of the typical areas you might find the asphalt pavement in your community. Asphalt is composed typically of several layers, and depending upon when and how your community was constructed and what the underlying conditions are, it may vary, but most often than not, asphalt pavement is composed of several layers. The bottom, of course, is, as you can see in the slide here, the very bottom is the subsoil. That's the native soil or the fill that's in the community. That is the underlying soil from what is considered the structural portion of the asphalt. Over top of the subsoil, a subbase is laid, and that's usually some sort of an aggregate. It's not made of asphalt. The subbase course is usually something that can be, it's either a gravel in some cases, like in a walking path, to provide a little drainage and what they call a capillary break, so that the moisture in the soil does not affect the pavement. Or it can be a what's called a dense graded aggregate, DGA, or in Pennsylvania, sometimes it's referred to as 2A. It's a type of quarry process stone that compacts very densely, so that you get a structural layer that's virtually impervious to water. So that's a means of protecting the asphalt as well and separating it from the subsoil. In the case of a roadway, you'll have a base course where it's a more coarse sort of stone mixed in with the bituminous material, and that's really the structural portion of your pavement, would be the subbase and the base course. And then the surface course is also an asphalt material, sometimes called the wearing course, and that's the course that's intended to take a beating. It does have some structural properties to it, but that's the layer of asphalt that when you do a remediation project, you're going to remove that and replace that. That's kind of the workhorse of your pavement layers. So when is it time to do a pavement remediation project? So everybody, hopefully, if you're in an association community or managing association, you have a reserve study. And in that reserve study, there is a useful life for the asphalt pavement. It's typically about 20 years. So even though your reserve study says it's time for an asphalt remediation, or even if it doesn't, the reserve study is meant as a budgetary tool. So it's not a schedule for replacement. So you can use it, though, as a clue to tell when you're coming up on a time when you may need to do a pavement project. So it should be based on a visual evaluation. So if you see that the pavement's coming to an end of your useful life on your reserve study, and you see that the pavement has some distress in it, and we'll talk about what some of those distress points look like, then it might be time for a change. So, and people are reluctant, our associations sometimes are reluctant because of the expense of an asphalt project. And asphalt and roofs and siding, they're usually the big projects that are costly for an association, and there may be some hesitation in doing those projects. But if your reserve study is up to date and you've been funding for that, that's what those funds are there for. They're there for you to remediate the pavement at the appropriate time, because as pavement deteriorates, the cost of that remediation can become more expensive. So you want to be sure that you are not doing it too early because your reserve study says so, or too late because you've waited too long to correct any problems in the pavement. So the timing of the project is also important. This is a good time of year if you're considering to do a pavement remediation project. It's a good time of year to considering doing a project in the following year in 2024, or if you're phasing the project over the next several years. It takes some time to put together specifications, as we'll see. Well, there's some evaluation that we need to do, and then some documents put together so that you could put it out to bid. So now is the time to start a project like that, start looking into getting bids for a project, putting together specifications. So the cost of material plays into the contractor's bids. So the cost of the asphalt material fluctuates throughout the year. Typically over the winter months, it starts to become more expensive, and in the spring, you might see a little bit of relief in the asphalt index. Also, the cost of labor, the crews for pavers tend to be not as large in the colder months, and the crews are larger during the warmer months, obviously, because they're doing a lot more work. And also, timing can play into your reserve funds, and we talked about that. If you have the funds available and it's time to do the pavement, it's worth doing it now instead of waiting for that pavement to deteriorate further when the project becomes more costly. So here's the asphalt index that I talked about, and you can see this is put out by the Department of Transportation, and this is not a direct cost of the material, but it's an index upon which the contractors base their pricing. So it's not a one-to-one pricing index, but it gives you an idea of where the cost of asphalt is going. So during the project, when the contractor quotes to you the cost of material, the cost of installing that material, if there's a difference in cost between when they quote that material and when they actually do the work, they will either bill you for the increase or the decrease, or give you a deduction for the decrease in that cost. So we talked about, why is it a good time? Community associations are structured to and required to have a reserve study in which they're funding for the replacement of common elements. And if you have private roadways in your community or walking paths, those are usually common elements for which you're funding. And some communities, if they don't have enough funding, they may special assess, or they may try to do something creative in their funding. But again, I stress having an updated reserve study so that you can be sure that you have adequate funds to do expensive projects like pavement, siding, roofing, things like that. So there is a remediation process. So many times an association will come to me, or a property manager will come to me and say, I have a bunch of asphalt quotes from all these contractors, which one should we pick? And it's really skipping ahead a few steps in the process, at least for the way that an engineering firm will approach the process. So you'll see as we go through this process, we'll provide you with ultimately some bids from contractors that you can compare across the board, and you can make a reasonable choice as to a contractor. When you just go straight to a contractor and say, please give us a quote for remediating our pavement within the community, you can get 3 different scopes of work from 3 different contractors with 3 different recommendations for what you should do. So this is our process that any engineering firm would use. So as you can see, it starts with evaluation. We move through preparation of documents um, that you can use in the bidding process. Once you get those apples comparable bids, you can select your contractor and then start the work. And we'll talk a little bit about maintenance after the work is completed and what is typical maintenance for pavement. So we'll start with evaluation. When we prepare specifications, the first thing we do is we take a look at the pavement. We go out and we visually observe the pavement. We walk through, we look for areas of distress. We look for any sort of indication that there may be subsurface problems in the pavement that need to be remediated. We look at areas, for example, in front of dumpsters. You may have some heavy vehicles coming in and out to collect refuse. In some cases, there's a main road of thoroughfare that goes through the community that may take a beating from other traffic from outside the community. So we look at those things. We look at areas of drainage around catch basins and in different parts of the parking areas. I will tell you that when we do visual observations, I strongly recommend that if you're using an engineer and they are scheduling site visits to come and do the observations, that you take a walk through with the engineer. I always invite the property manager when I first get on site to take a look at the pavement. I invite the property manager or perhaps anybody on the board who's familiar with the pavement conditions to take a walk through with me and identify any areas where they are having a drainage problem, because it's not always visually obvious to me where that's happening, or to any engineer. You may have some drainage problems in areas that on a dry sunny day walking through that are not apparent. Another thing that's not apparent during visual observations are subsurface conditions and the structure of the existing pavement. So sometimes we need to do, in addition to those visual evaluations, we need to do some surface testing. Most typically that is pavement core. We always do as a basis asphalt pavement core so that we can see what's existing. What type of subbase do you have? And if you'll remember, we talked about those layers. Here are those layers again. We take a look at what are the thicknesses of each of these courses, and this subsoil on the very bottom, what is that composed of? And oftentimes when they do a pavement core, they can not always, but sometimes they can determine whether there is a clayey material underneath or what kind of material that might impact drainage underneath those layers. So here are some of the items that we might be looking for, some of the distresses we might be looking for when we're doing the visual observations for the pavement. So usually the most obvious are depressions and potholes. That top surface course, once it starts to get cracks in it, and once those cracks start to widen, or in areas where there's a lot of stop and go traffic, you might start to develop potholes. And potholes happen most often when the surface course is not adequately maintained over the life of the pavement. And once that surface course starts to deteriorate and that water gets in there, those surface layers start to break off and wash away, and you end up with potholes in locations where there's a lot of wear and tear on the pavement, or where there's a lot of pavement seams. And also once potholes develop, that indicates that you may need to do some subbase repair in that area as well. And we'll talk about how that's outside usually of the base contract of a project when the contractor bids on it. Another type of distress we're looking for are open cracks. So here's an example of a crack, and this crack may have developed sometimes along an old seam line, or sometimes along a stress crack, sometimes even in new pavement when it's installed between structures in the roadways. Oftentimes if you have two catch basins across the street from each other with a manhole in the middle, you can develop a stress crack across the pavement, and that needs to be maintained so it doesn't open like this. sometimes, well, there's different types of cracking that can develop along seams or along flow lines, but in essence, once those cracks form, you need to maintain them and keep them sealed as just part of regular maintenance, because they do open over time. Asphalt pavement shrinks over time. It becomes more brittle over time, and these cracks do open up. Even as you're maintaining them, as the pavement ages, just the shrinkage will cause these cracks to open. We're also looking for alligator cracking, and this is named alligator cracking for an obvious reason. It looks like alligator scales, but what it essentially indicates is that the subbase, the bearing capacity of the subbase has failed, and it causes the asphalt pavement on top to break up. In this particular case, I included this photo because this shows an overlay that was installed over top of the old pavement, which had alligator cracking. And we don't recommend putting just an overlay. And a lot of times a contractor will recommend this just as a cost savings thing, a cost savings method. If when communities don't want to do or can't afford a full remediation of their pavement, they'll often recommend that you put an overlay over it to buy you some time. I'm not a big fan of overlays for obvious reasons in this photo, because it doesn't address the underlying condition. So in this particular case, the overlay had been put over top of the original pavement for whatever reason the association had chosen this type of remediation in the past. And you can see that where that overlay was put over the old deterioration, that it has completely reflected up through, and the overlay is now gone. And this happens usually in a fairly short period of time with overlays, where the cracks will reflect up through in just a matter of a year or two, and then you get this deterioration that starts to happen very rapidly. So we talked earlier about some types of cracks. There are reflective cracks, which happen when you have some deterioration in the underlying layers, and there's a crack there that isn't taken care of, and then you put asphalt over top of that. That crack doesn't just go away. That crack starts to, there's still it's still a point of stress within the pavement, and if you overlay that without repairing it, that crack will reflect up through the new pavement that you've put on top of it. Another type of cracking is seam cracking. We often see this along center lines, where the underlying subbase has a seam in it, and then over top the asphalt is laid, and then there's a seam on top in the top course. So if there's a crack or a stress in that underlying base layer, that seam crack can reflect up through your upper pavement, your new pavement. This also occurs along, you'll see this quite often between where the roadway, where you have parking bays that along the roadway, and where the parking bay edge meets the roadway edge, the seam cracks can often develop there as well. And in those locations, the grading is often designed so that the water flows along those areas. So you not only get the seam cracking, but you also get water infiltration that starts potholes in those areas. So it's an accelerated deterioration that begins to happen. Another type of distress we're looking for is settlement in the pavement. Settlement can happen for many reasons. Sometimes in new construction, they try to compact, the contractor, when they're building the roadways and stormwater facilities in the roadways. This, for example, in this photo, this catch basin is constructed. If you look inside, you often see the concrete box, and when they're constructing these, they'll try to backfill along the edges of the box as best they can when they're constructing it. The big compaction machinery can't get in to compact around these boxes, so they usually end up using handheld mechanical devices or hand tamping to get as best compaction as they can around the box. But sometimes over time, there's just a natural soil consolidation that happens, where you'll start to see some settlement around the catch basin boxes. This type of settlement can also happen in older pavements and in older communities where there might be a bad pipe connection at the junction of the box and where the pipe comes into the box. Usually that's grouted. Sometimes if that grout is deteriorated, or there's deterioration in the riser course that's right underneath the frame that you see in the picture here. It's supposed to be grouted between the blocks. Sometimes just over time and salt on the roadways can deteriorate those mortar joints. And once those mortar joints are gone and the soil starts to get in, you get a subtraction of soil underneath the pavement around, and you might see some settlement like this. So this is something you'd want to address. This is something we identify when we are evaluating pavement, and we might call an area like this out for some sort of repair as part of the specifications. And we talked earlier about overlays. Again, overlays, they are often a temporary measure to give you a smooth surface and an aesthetic appeal and buy some time. Overlays, though, cause problems when you do eventually do a asphalt remediation. So when we take the cores, we're looking for, when we take those pavement cores down through the asphalt, we're looking for several things when we do those cores, and we'll talk about that a little later on. But one of them is we're looking for how many layers of pavement are there. And usually if we start to see more than 2 layers of pavement, especially in an older community like this, we know that some overlays have been done in the past, and it starts to become a problem because when we mill off that surface, we're not always getting right down into the older top course layers, the original top course layers, and sometimes it's necessary to mill a little deeper so that we can completely get rid of that overlay and get into those original asphalt layers, which of course increases the cost of a project. So again, overlay, you really want to consider the cost, the future costs, the long-term costs of doing an asphalt overlay versus a proper pavement remediation where you're repairing those underlying layers. So in addition to our visual evaluation, I mentioned that we, just as a matter of course, as part of our specification preparation, do asphalt core testing. Sometimes the asphalt core testing, it doesn't happen often, but sometimes the asphalt core testing does not reveal obvious problems that a community might be having. Sometimes in the case of clay soils, if we can't determine from the asphalt cores what type of subsoils there are, but we could see that there's an obvious problem with rutting or settlement or massive deterioration of the pavement, we might also recommend some soil sampling to be done so that we can determine what's going on in those subsoil conditions. And there's various types of testing available that can give us an indication of what types of materials are under there, or what the bearing capacity of those soils are. Again, it's not something that is typical for a pavement remediation, but when there are extenuating circumstances, we may recommend further soil sample testing. So I've been talking a lot about these pavement core samples. So what are they? So when we contract with a coring firm, they come out, and as on the left you can see the apparatus that takes the core through the pavement. It's usually about a 4-inch diameter core. And what they'll do is they'll pull up the entire pavement sample. They'll go right down to the aggregate base, and they will pull up the asphalt layers. We're looking for a couple of things in the core sample. Again, I mentioned that we're looking for the number of layers because that gives us an indication of if an overlay has been done in the past. We're also looking for the depth of the various layers. So we're looking for the depth of the base course layer, and we're looking for the thickness of the top course layer as well. Thickness of the top course is important because it tells us whether or not the milling, when they come through and they mill, off the top 2 inches of pavement, whether there is going to be enough pavement there to actually do a milling and to do an overlay. We're also looking for separation or adhesion between the layers. That becomes as important as well. We're looking for a nice adhesion between the base course and the top course. As you can see in the sample on the right, there's no adhesion there. There are 2 separate layers that came up, and that's not ideal. It's not terrible, but it's not ideal in that when the contractor eventually does mill off that top course, you may get some delamination between the remaining. Sometimes there's remaining portions of old top course that need to be cleaned off, and you want to the contractor then has to go through and make sure everything is very, very clean and there's no delamination between the remaining layers before they put down the new asphalt. So this can often happen in we see this a lot in phased communities that were constructed as phases, and the reason being is that when the community is first being constructed, the contractor will put down those base course layers, and then they'll use that as their surface to drive over as they're constructing the community. And then once all the construction is completed, that's when the contractor comes back and puts in the top course layers. So usually to properly do that, the contractor should put down, they should make any pavement repairs to the base course. They may want to scarify some areas of the base course just so they get proper adhesion, put down tack coat. We'll see what that is later. It's kind of a sticky glue between the base course and the top course, and then they can put the new top course on. So oftentimes we'll see this separation when a community is going for their first pavement remediation, and that old construction base course and that top course. Sometimes even if the contractor does do all the proper things, they sometimes don't completely adhere to each other, only because the base course is a little older. So once we're done with our visual observations and we've gathered our data, we can decide what is the best method for remediation for the pavement. So most pavement remediation projects are simple milling and overlay, meaning that the basic scope of work is to mill off usually 2 inches of top course and put back 2 inches of top course. And that is really in its most simple terms is what you're doing when you're remediating the pavement. Sometimes if there is a sub-base condition, or if the pavement is not thick enough to mill and overlay, keep in mind that miller comes through and you've got heavy trucks coming over it. So we're looking for, when we do those pavement core samples, we're looking for the point where after they mill off that 2 inches of pavement, is there enough asphalt left to be a proper stable sub-base for the new pavement that you're putting on. In some cases, if the pavement is too thin and the underlying subsoil does not have proper bearing capacity, say for example it's a clay soil, we've had several projects where there's only 3 inches of asphalt there, and then underneath is very clayey soil. So you've got a very thin pavement, and you've got a very squishy, if you will, in layman's terms, soil, that it's really not a good candidate for a straight milling and overlay. And we may, in a case like that, recommend pavement reconstruction, so you get a full useful life and usefulness out of your pavement. And also, even in the case of a milling and overlay, there may be areas of pavement that we can see. We talked about those pothole areas, or maybe areas where there's some rutting or settlement, where we know that there's going to be some pavement reconstruction in those areas. So even though milling and overlay is the base scope of work, there may be some additional areas of pavement reconstruction that we will specify. So there are some items also that are usually considered when you're going to do a pavement remediation. It's also the time to consider doing some additional work that is pavement related. One might be sidewalks, and oftentimes the community has sidewalks that are along the roadways. sometimes there's a grass strip between them, sometimes they're right up against the curb. But usually where those sidewalks come down, the sidewalk ramp and meet the pavement at a pavement crossing, those sidewalks either are in poor condition or may need to be adjusted to meet the new pavement elevation. So the additional work can sometimes include sidewalks as part of that. Curbing is always a something to consider. Curbing can include Belgian block curb, or there may be concrete curb that needs to be evaluated. Usually what we do is we don't include curbing in the main contract, in the main portion of the bid, but we'll have that as a unit price, and we'll talk about the difference between the base bid and the unit cost, because curbing is something that takes a beating from year to year, especially if you have a phased pavement project. We usually recommend that at the pre-construction meeting, once you've got your contractor lined up, he's ready to begin work, we walk through with the contractor and mark out the areas of curbs that should be replaced. And we mark that out and they replace that as part of the project. Usually we don't do that as part of, we don't quantify curbing when we're doing the specification, only because as that curbing overwinters, the plows hit it, further deterioration from salt can occur. So it's better to mark out curbing and quantify that right before you begin your project. Driveways, sometimes there are unit driveways, again, that are an asphalt, all asphaltic material that can be part of your pavement remediation project. Usually driveways you want to do before you do the main roadways, just so that you're not driving over your new roadways to replace driveways, because it is very messy work. Traffic control, if you have a large community, sometimes some roads need to be blocked off. Things to those nature. Every project is different, so traffic control can mean different things for different projects. Pavement striping. Once you have your new pavement, you need to put back any striping. That's usually part of the base bid, and striping is typically put back in the same pattern that it was before, unless there are some circumstances where the association wants some striping moved around. But that should be discussed before you do your specifications, because our specs have the contractor putting back striping in the pattern in which it was removed. Drainage, we talked about drainage. Again, I want to stress that areas of poor drainage are not always visually identifiable to the engineer when they're on site. So when the engineer schedules those that walkthrough, we strongly recommend that you walk through with them and show them any areas, point out any areas that you have specific concerns. So the next step after we do the evaluation of the pavement is to prepare specifications. So this would usually include the contract drawings and a project manual. And in the project manual are the bid forms that the contractor would use to return a bid to you. So our technical specifications, as any engineering firm would use, if you're doing new pavement design, if you're expanding a parking area or doing something like that, you're going to that addition is going to be based on the residential site improvement standards and any municipal requirements. If you're doing a pavement remediation or even a new pavement design, the asphalt mix requirements would have to meet NJDOT standards. Residential site improvement standards reference the NJDOT standards. So we would always specify a pavement mix that is, in the case of current remediation projects, it's something called super pave, and you may have heard that. It's essentially it has the same components as the older, what they called Marshall mixes, but the ratios are a little different. They look a little different than the older Marshall mixes when they put them down. So in communities that are a little older, you have the old Marshall mix pavements, and they tend to be very pliable, very smooth. The newer super pave mixes are a little more you see a little more stones in the surface. It doesn't have as smooth a finish as the old Marshall mixes. I'll tell you that the contractors do a very good job in the residential communities of getting it as smooth as possible. Usually a very good contractor can get the pavement to look very nice on the surface. The super pave that they use now is a little more brittle. There's recycled asphalt product in it now. That is, it doesn't, I don't want to say it doesn't perform as well. It performs differently than the original Marshall mixes. And also included in the specifications are any sort of sub-base preparation that may be required. This is usually when we're doing a full depth pavement remediation. So let's just go back, technical specifications again include the contract drawings and the project manual. So within the project manual are the bid forms. So the bid forms have, and what I mentioned earlier, the base bid, which are all the items that you know that you're going to have to do in a pavement remediation project. So in my example here, this was actually taken from a multi-phase project that's going to be done over the course of several years. And you can see that under roadway pavement remediation, as I mentioned, the basic pavement project is to mill the asphalt surface. You could see that in item 4 there, and to install the new top course, which is in item 5, and of course to put back any pavement markings, which is item 6 in this particular example. So the quantities are provided in the base contract so that all the contractors are bidding on the same thing. You don't get a contractor who comes in and says, I'm going to use these quantities and I'm only going to do these areas and I'm going to mill 1 inch or I'm going to do an overlay. Having a bid form where every contractor is bidding on the same thing in the same format will give you a means of comparing each item across the board, and you can make a better decision on which contractor is the best for your project. So also included in the bid form is unit pricing. Now, unit pricing, as you recall, base bid are the items that you know you're going to have to do as part of a pavement project. It's just, just what you're going to have to do. Unit pricing covers things that may be unforeseen conditions, and because it's construction, it is usually the case that when you mill off that surface pavement, there are areas underneath that you can't see, you can't visually assess them, you cannot detect them through any type of testing, where you mill off that top course and there are base course areas that need to be repaired, or there may be cracks in the base course that need to be bridged with a reinforcement fabric before the top course gets put back on. What's not shown in this particular example, just so it's readable, I've only included these, but other items you might want to include in unit pricing, and the engineer can decide what belongs in the unit pricing for your particular project. But repairs to catch basins, changing out the steel on catch basins. One item of unit pricing that becomes important is repair of the box, the catch basin box. Sometimes, as I mentioned before, if that mortar is deteriorated between the riser course, that's something that can be included as unit pricing, so that when the contractor comes through and they remove the steel and they take a look at the inside of the basin, if they see that there is some block repair that needs to be done, that should be done prior to doing your pavement project. They'll come in with a concrete contractor, and they will repair those basins prior to doing the roadway remediation. And because they're related, as we saw with the settlement around the catch basin, pavement can deteriorate if your catch basins are not properly repaired. So again, that's the difference between base bid, the things you know you need to do, and unit pricing, things you may need to do, or the things that may need to be repaired because of unforeseen conditions. So here's just an example of the contract drawings. This is a very basic example that shows the layout of this the pavement for this particular project. In this case, there are some areas that the engineer can tell that they're going to need some base course repairs. And if you notice, most of them are along the areas where you would often see pavement seams. So those pavement seams, just over time, that asphalt shrinks, those cracks can open up, and if they're not maintained, water can get in there and start to deteriorate the pavement, where you need to do base repairs. And here are just some sample details that are included in the specifications, just showing what the thickness of the overlay should be, how the subsurface layer should be treated if a problem is encountered, and a typical striping specification, just how wide the stripe should be, what type of paint should be used in that striping. So once the bid package is put out to bid and the contractors return their bids, if you're using an engineer for bidding services, we will give you a bid summary. We'll take all those bids and put it in spreadsheet form, and you can see along the left side here are all those items that were in the bid form. And you can compare across the board what the contractor pricing is. You could see the total cost of the base bid. Usually what we'll do is when we provide this summary, we'll show the cost of the base bid based on the contractor pricing, and then we'll include also a line under that shows contingencies between 10 and 20%. And those contingencies take into account those unit costs, those unforeseen items. So even though you have this base bid, just for budgeting purposes, we usually like to show a range between 10 and 20% contingencies. We find that just based on historical data from our other projects, that contingencies are average around 15% of the base bid. So when you select your contractor, you're looking at several different factors. The lowest bid is not always the best bid. Pricing is important, and you want to do the project economically, but you're also looking at schedule. You're looking at the experience of that contractor. Are they reputable? Have other people use them? Has your engineer worked with them before? Has your property manager worked with them before? What was their experience? And also the references. In the project manual, the bid form, we ask for references. Nobody, of course, is going to give a bad reference, but it gives you an idea of the type and scope of projects that contractor has done before. Have they only done parking lots? Have they only done pothole repair? Or are they equipped and capable of doing a good project, doing a good job on your roadway project that may require a little more in-depth construction. So the code word for today is mashed potatoes, in the spirit of Thanksgiving. So if you are contacting us for CEU credits, the code word is mashed potatoes. Okay, so when we begin the work, when we get into the contract administration phase, if you've contracted with your engineer to be present during construction, you usually have a contract administration contract with your engineer. We always recommend doing a pre-construction meeting. So before anybody shows up on site with any equipment, we strongly recommend that we do a walkthrough with the contractor, the association, and the engineer, to talk about things like equipment staging and where the porta potty will go, and any particular concerns. If there are concerns, a lot of times in 55 and over communities, there are concerns about staging the work in such a way that if there's an emergency, people can get in and out, or that can be considered in advance of beginning work. So there are different sort of strategic things that should be discussed at a pre-construction meeting, so that expectations are laid out and questions are answered before the work begins. So the engineer can be on site and usually it can be done two ways. Either the engineer can be on site all the time, every day, whenever the contractor is, which can be very expensive, or the engineer can come out at key portions of the project. So if we're coming out at key portions of the project, we usually recommend, number one, the pre-construction meeting I mentioned, and then coming out once that top course is milled off to walk the base course with the contractor and identify any areas that need base repair or any other items within the scope of work that need attention before they put that top course back on. We will usually come back when the top course is on to have a look at how the top course is draining, and look at the seams, and in general how if there are any punch list items in regard to that top course. And then once we'll come back again to look at to take a walk through with the contractor, the association, and the engineer again to identify any areas of concern in the completed work. And then we also review any of the contractor submitted invoices. We compare it to the original bid, give a summary of a comparison between the invoice and the original bid. So everything is laid out so you could see how those costs are derived. And then usually there is when you go to pay the invoice, there is a retainage that's in there for any sort of punch list items. And then once all those punch list items are satisfied, the retainage for the project is released. So just give you some visuals, some photos on what actually happens during the pavement project. I'm sure property managers have seen many pavement projects in their communities over the years, and they're familiar with the equipment that's being used and the progression of the work. It is dusty work, it's messy work, it's inconvenient work, but the contractors try to get in and get out in the most convenient, providing the most convenience to the community as possible. It is, however, dusty work. So if you're planning any kind of power washing for the community or anything like that, you want to time it to be done after your pavement work is done, because you're going to power wash and then everything's going to be covered with dust again. It's just the nature of the construction. So the contractor will start out with milling the original pavement. This is what the equipment looks like. This is the miller on the left side, and they convey it into the truck, which hauls it off site. And then after the pavement surface is milled, it's going to look like this. It's going to have some striations in it. Usually you can drive on the milled course. So usually the contractor will come through on day one and do the milling. The community can put vehicles on it again. They can park vehicles on it. They can drive over the milled surface typically that evening. The contractor will mark out any areas. In this particular case, you could see they milled out the pavement around this catch basin here. They put a cone on it. You have to be careful driving on the milled pavement, because the contractor may have areas marked out that they've milled out, or maybe a tripping hazard while the work is in progress. So then the base course I mentioned, Kipcon will come after the top course is milled off. We'll walk the base course with the contractor and identify the areas that need base course reconstruction. Here's an example of what that base course reconstruction looks like. And again, you'll notice that this is in that area that I mentioned between the parking bay and the edge of the roadway that always seems to get, there's a seam there, there's usually water flows along there. These areas get really beat up. So in this case, you could see the entire area between the parking bay and the roadway has been reconstructed. The base course has been reconstructed here. Another type of base course that's repair that's often done is a crack repair fabric. And this is a reinforced fabric in areas of cracks that if we see closed cracks in the pavement that are not deteriorated, that's not such a concern. But when those cracks start to open up, as we talked about, the pavement shrinks, and if that shrinkage has happened in the base course, or if the crack is deteriorated in some way, we'll recommend that it's spanned with this crack repair fabric. It's not necessary to go through the expense of milling it up and replacing that base course, but it should be reinforced in some way before the top course is put back on. So then the contractor can begin laying down asphalt. In this case, you can see all the asphalt was taken down, right down to the sub base in this particular case. So they had to lay down new base course in this area. So they'll start with that if they need to, and start laying down the asphalt. If on top of the base course, a tack course is laid down, whether it's a new asphalt or whether it's the old base course that's been milled and scarified. They'll put down this glue, quote unquote, that will go between the base course and the top course. And then the top course will be overlaid. And this is an example of the top course. One thing I want to point out is you can see in the foreground here where the screed went through and they were able to roll the pavement with a roller, and you can see how smooth that is. And you'll notice the gentleman up in the corner hand working the corners of the parking areas. So in the areas that the equipment can't get in, they need to hand work that material into the corners of the parking areas. In some cases around certain areas of catch basins, they need to hand tamp that material, or they can use a mechanical compaction device. So here's the roller. In this case, they're going through and they're compacting the pavement. They roll over. This is a smaller piece of equipment. There are larger rollers that go through and do the roadways. They usually do the parking areas with this size of equipment. And here's the completed roadway. So always looks very nice. I want to point out that pavement does oxidize over time. So new asphalt always has that a nice dark color to it. As it oxidizes, it does become lighter. So in areas where I often get the question, can you match the pavement? Can you have the contractor match the asphalt pavement to this older area of asphalt pavement in color? That's not possible. The asphalt does blend over time. As the pavement gets older, the colors do sort of even out with each other, but the demarcation between new asphalt and old asphalt will always have a color difference. There's just really no way to avoid it. And again, here's a completed roadway. Here's the seam down the middle that I mentioned. So this seam, as you can see, it's a closed seam. They've compacted the seam. This is what a properly constructed seam looks like. So sometimes people in the community see this and they're concerned because they can see a stripe in the pavement, but there's no open crack here. This is properly compacted between the passes of the screed. And here's the final project. The pavement is being striped. And again, there's that seam down the center line of the pavement. It's visible, but it's properly constructed. So ongoing maintenance. Once your pavement is installed, it will, just like everything else in your community, will begin to age over time. So you're going to want to do some regular maintenance for your pavement. Seal coating is you may choose to do it or not, depending on which contractor you talk to. Some recommend it, some don't. A couple of notes I want to make about seal coating is you want to do seal coating if you're going to do seal coating 2 years after the overlay. But then once you do seal coating, you need to maintain it to get the benefit from it. So 2 years after overlay, and then generally every 5 years thereafter at a maximum, if you want to get the benefit. The seal coating, it does darken the pavement, so you get that aesthetic benefit from it. But the real purpose of the seal coating is UV protection for the pavement, and to keep the fines in the smaller components of that asphalt adhere to the surface of the pavement, because that helps the integrity of the pavement and protects against UV deterioration. As the sun shines on asphalt, it starts to break down that bituminous material in the upper portion. That's why you get that color difference. As it oxidizes over time, that color difference happens. So that the seal coating is meant to protect against that as well as it can over time. Pavement's still going to age even if you seal coat it. But number one, seal coating needs to be maintained. Number two is seal coating does show scratches from when snow removal contractors come through. If you do have seal coating anywhere, you might want to talk to your snow removal vendor about using a polymer or rubber blade to protect against scratches in the seal coating, because that will happen. Other types of maintenance are crack filling. You want to use an appropriate material and go through, and as the pavement ages and those seam cracks start to open up or other cracks start to develop, crack filling is important. And if you're going to seal coat, and you're coming up on that seal coating again, you want to make sure you walk through and do any crack filling before you seal coat again, because seal coating does not fill cracks. It protects the surface. It protects the surface of the pavement. Crack filling is what's needed to protect cracks. You may need localized repairs. Sometimes just from the weight of vehicles sometimes, or there may be some potholes that start to develop. You want to repair those areas as soon as possible, because they will trigger some accelerated and deep deterioration in your pavement. So you want to make sure to repair anything that is damaged in any way in your pavement, just so you get the full useful life. And you want to do some ongoing observations. When you have your reserve study done, the reserve study, if you have somebody coming out doing an on-site visual inspections for reserve studies, they can do a general assessment of the condition of the pavement and give some recommendations in regard to the remaining useful life of the pavement. So you always want to have an updated reserve study in a timely fashion. So number one, you're aware of the condition of your pavement, and number two, that you have adequate funding for when you do need to do a pavement remediation project. So let's see, we've got some questions in the chat here. So I have a question here. Years between, let me scroll up. Can I get a copy of this presentation to share with my roads committee? You absolutely can. You can contact Chelsea in our office, or Jody Smallwood, who's, let me put her, actually, oops, the last slide. Here we go. Here is Jody Smallwood's email as well. You can contact her, and we can certainly send you a copy of this presentation. It says our small community, 168 units, was built by different builders over 3 phases. That's very common. Between 2 and 4 years between completion of each phase, we have tried to transition our projects to get them done for the entire community at one time. Do you recommend this procedure of delaying the earlier phase to do multiple phases at the same time, or doing each phase at one time? So this is a very good question, because this comes down to several different factors. If you have, again, as I mentioned, if your pavement is deteriorating, the cost of the repair increases as that pavement deteriorates. So you want to consider number one, the condition of all the phases of your pavement. If you have, if all of them are in bad shape, you might want to consider getting everything done at once. If it's not so pressing, sometimes you can do the project in phases. You want to take a look at the cost of each phase. So when we do our specs for large communities that are in phases, we can get pricing from the contractor to do each phase, and that's usually more, because they have to leave the site and then come back the next year. So it's always more expensive than doing the project at once. And so we will ask for, as an option, doing the project in phases, and then we will ask for optional pricing if they were to do the entire community in one phase in 1 year. So sometimes you can realize a savings doing that. Also, you need to consider that the cost of asphalt typically goes up. There are times when it has come down in present year. it's relatively expensive to do a pavement project, and it just historically, based on what asphalt prices do, it may be more expensive to do those projects in future years. So there's a couple different ways you can approach it, and different factors you need to consider. If you want some more information on that, please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to talk with you about it. And do you recommend seal coating? So we talked extensively about seal coating. If you have any more questions, please feel free to contact our office. I'm happy to discuss it with you. All right, so we're up against 10:30. And we like to end promptly too, so that you can get on with your day. Again, if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. And again, if you're going for CEU credits, contact either Jody Smallwood, whose email address is there. You can contact me or Chelsea with the password. I think it was mashed potatoes, and we can provide that for you. Also, if you would like a copy of this presentation, we can provide that as well. So thank you very much, everyone, today for attending, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving and enjoy the rest of your day.